Tuesday, February 11th, 1997. Le Portel, a small town south of Boulogne-sur-Mer, is celebrating its carnival for 3 days. The festivities are in full swing, and tonight is the final night everyone has been eagerly awaiting. Sisters Peggy and Amélie Merlin have never missed it. This year, they have invited their friends Isabelle and Audrey Raffin. The girls met 5 months ago. 16-year-old Amélie and 17-year-old Audrey became friends at school after the Raffin sisters moved to Le Portel. Soon they became inseparable, just like their older sisters, 20-year-old Peggy and Isabelle. The girls spend the whole afternoon carefully getting ready. Everything has to be perfect for the carnival evening. At last, they are ready. Peggy has turned into a marquise, Amélie into Pierrot, Audrey has chosen a musketeer's costume, and Isabelle has become an Indian. Audrey and Isabelle are joined by their older sister, Virginia. At 8:30 p.m., the 5 girls leave the house and head for the square where the festivities are taking place. All 5 are in high spirits, despite the cold and rain that night. They sing and dance along with everyone else. After running into friends, they stop briefly at a cafe to warm up. At 11:30 p.m., it is time to go down to Portel Beach to see the highlight of the show. But Virginia decides to go home because she has a headache. On the beach, a huge bonfire has already been prepared, into which they throw Baptiste, a cloth dummy. This is the main spectacle Peggy and Amélie want to show Audrey and Isabelle. At midnight, the stuffed figure has burned down, and as tradition requires, all the carnival goers head to the beach at Equihen, a village 3 kilometers to the south. 2 hours earlier, the girls had arranged to meet their friend Yves halfway and go together. But the young man never sees them. He assumes they changed their minds and went to warm up at Peggy and Amélie's place. In fact, Yves has no reason to worry. The carnival is crowded, and townspeople in costume keep moving back and forth between Portel and Equihen. Morning came. The carnival was over, and Peggy and Amélie's mother drove to the main square to pick her daughters up. Marie-José Merlin had bought croissants so they could have a bite to eat together and listen to the girls' story about the night, but they didn't show up at the meeting place. Around 7:30 a.m., she went back home, woke Virginia, and asked where the girls were and why they still hadn't returned. Virginia replied that the carnival ends around 6-7 a.m., so they might simply need more time to get back. Or they could have stayed the night at Isabelle and Audrey's. Meanwhile, Isabelle and Audrey's mother, Laure, was also starting to worry. She had let her daughters go to the carnival for the first time and was anxious that they still hadn't come home, but she assumed they had stayed overnight at Marie-José's. Time passed, and when the 2 mothers spoke on the phone, it turned out that neither of them had seen the girls. None of their friends or relatives knew where they were either. The worry kept growing. It wasn't like the girls to disappear like that. They always told their families if they were going to be late. At 9 p.m., beside themselves with worry, the parents went to the police station, but to their bitter disappointment, the officers were not concerned at all. The girls were at exactly that age when you could let loose and forget about everything, especially in the middle of carnival season. The police suggested there might be a carnival in a neighboring town and that the girls had gone there to have fun. In other words, to them, the girls' disappearance amounted to nothing more than a simple runaway, but the parents knew they would never have run off in carnival costumes without money or identification. Besides, they were very close to their mothers. Marie-José Merlin had recently suffered a heart attack, and her daughters were afraid to do anything that might upset her. Isabelle and Audrey were also deeply attached to Laure. After their mother died, when the girls were 3, 4, and 6, Laure adopted Audrey, Isabelle, and their older sister, Virginia. The girls cherished the love Laure had given them and would certainly not have run away. Convinced there was no point in fleeing, and faced with the police's lack of response, the families organized the search themselves. They began putting up flyers around town, searched the lighthouse, the beaches, and the abandoned bunkers built during World War II, and even checked the town's disused tunnel. In one cafe, on a wall of souvenir carnival photos, they found a picture of Audrey in her musketeer costume, further proof that the girls had been at the carnival. But over the next 48 hours, there was no other news of them. Then, thanks to the flyers, eyewitness calls began coming in to the Lamotte family's home. People confirmed that they had seen the girls in Le Portel and remembered the 4 costumes, but after the crowd headed toward Equihen, no one saw them again. Even more troubling, witnesses reported a white van with white stripes whose occupants stared intently at the revelers and followed them, generally behaving in a suspicious manner. They drew extra attention because, on that carnival night, they were the only ones not wearing costumes. It was a very promising lead, but the police continued to stick to the runaway theory. The families, tired of hearing the same excuses, decided to alert the press. Fortunately, journalists did not believe the runaway version, and on Sunday, February 16th, a first article appeared in the local newspaper. In it, the journalist also mentioned a van with green stripes. Reporters across the country picked up the story. Faced with media pressure, the prosecutor finally acknowledged that running away might not be the only explanation for what had happened. 6 days after the girl's disappearance, the investigation was restarted from scratch. The police quickly confirmed that a specific van had been seen on the night of the carnival and found witnesses, 2 families, who provided the vehicle's license plate number. At the same time, Law received another call at home. A woman said that the van being sought was in a nearby village. According to her, it belonged to 2 scrap metal dealers, well known in the village for their criminal behavior. She added that they needed to hurry because the brothers were already repainting the van. Using the license plate, the police also identified the brothers as Jean-Michel and Jean-Louis Gurdon. Could the brothers have been the kidnappers of the 4 girls? It turned out the brothers had long been known to law enforcement. They grew up almost uneducated, in conditions completely unfit for a normal life. They lived apart from society. Rumors said their mother had incestuous relationships with her sons, and their father was an aggressive alcoholic. 38-year-old Jean-Louis, the elder brother, has developmental impairments. He was convicted of molesting girls and spent a year and a half in prison. Barely out of jail, he received a 10-year sentence for assaulting a girl, but was released after 5. His brother Jean-Michel's criminal record was even more extensive. At 15, he attacked a 12-year-old girl so brutally that he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, something rare. After his release, as his wife was preparing to become a mother, he killed his former girlfriend, 18-year-old Anita Dassenville. He was sentenced to 15 years but was released after 9. Jean-Michel was married and had 3 children, one of whom, a young girl named Jennifer, died of meningitis. His second wife described him as a wonderful husband and a caring father, an opinion many did not share. People around him saw him as a bundle of nerves with muscles. If the young girls had fallen into the brothers' hands, the worst had to be feared. That was enough for the police to bring the brothers in for questioning. On Wednesday, a week after the girls disappeared, the police carried out a large-scale operation to arrest the Gurdon brothers. And if they really were holding the girls, the slightest mistake could be fatal. The brothers did not resist arrest, but they were surprised by the police's arrival. The girls were not in the house, although what the officers found horrified them. The place looked more like a dump and reeked of filth. A small boy sat half-naked next to a German shepherd eating from a dog bowl. In total, 9 people lived in the house, including 5 children under the age of 12. The police seized the van. It had been repainted and, worse still, the interior had been cleaned with extreme thoroughness. What were the brothers trying to hide? For investigators, it became a race against time. They could hold the brothers for no more than 48 hours and had to get them to talk, because for now they had suspicions but absolutely no physical evidence. The brothers insisted in unison that they had not gone anywhere near the Carnival Square. After they were confronted with testimony from numerous witnesses, they admitted they had merely driven past but swore they had not crossed paths with the girls. On Friday morning, after the brothers had already been in custody for 30 hours, investigators were running out of time. They decided to change tactics. A detective knew the brothers had a younger sister who had disappeared long ago and was most likely already dead. Jean-Louis had been deeply attached to his sister and missed her terribly after she vanished. The detective laid out photos of the missing girls and began talking to the suspect about each one. He appealed to his emotions, saying they had families waiting for them. His sister could not be saved, but if the girls were still alive, they could still be helped and returned home to their loved ones. At these words, Jean-Louis leaned back in his chair, sighed, and stated that the girls were dead and that he was directly involved. He agreed to show where the bodies were buried. The journalists crowding outside the police station saw a police car speed off in an unknown direction and followed it. The whole convoy stopped at the foot of a sand dune. The officers, together with Jean-Louis, went to the spot he indicated. They had to dig for a long time, so long that the detectives began to think he had lied and that there were no bodies there. Then a scrap of red fabric from a musketeer costume appeared. All 4 girls were lying in a pit, stacked 2 by 2. They were still wearing the carnival costumes they had worn to the masquerade. On the other side of the dune, the impatiently waiting journalists saw 4 hearses arrive, silently. Then they understood it was the 4 missing friends and hurried to report it to the public. The girls' families learned the horrific news on the radio. The missing girls had been found. But the nightmare was only beginning. On February 24th, forensic pathologists carried out autopsies. They determined that the killer's method was strangulation and that 3 of the girls had been sexually assaulted. Isabelle was the first victim. She was savagely beaten and then strangled. She likely put up the fiercest resistance to the abductors. Peggy was sexually assaulted and then they tried to strangle her, but she was buried alive. Grains of sand were found in her esophagus, meaning she was still breathing when she was buried. Amélie was even more badly injured than the previous 2 girls. She was assaulted and beaten, then killed. Finally, young Audrey was subjected to every kind of violence one can imagine. When Audrey was the last one still alive, the perpetrators likely treated it like a game. Now, the police wanted to know exactly how it had happened, but during questioning, the brothers gave contradictory accounts that only begin the same way. At around 11 p.m., they came across 4 girls in Musketeer, Indian, Marquise, and Pierrot costumes and agreed to give them a lift to Equihenne. The trip was only 3 kilometers, and one of the girls quickly realized they were driving for too long and in the wrong direction. The girls shouted that they wanted to get out. One of them tried to open the van door, but it was locked. According to Jean-Louis, Michel told him to calm the captives down while he drove even faster. They arrived at Sainte-Cécile Beach and took the captives into an abandoned blockhouse, wartime defensive structures still found in France. The blockhouse had only one exit, making it an ideal prison for the girls. And at that point, the brothers' stories diverge. Jean-Louis said that he guarded the girls in the blockhouse while Jean-Michel took them out one by one. When his brother came for the last captive, Jean-Louis followed them up to the top of the dunes, where 3 girls lay motionless, sprawled on the ground. In his presence, Jean-Michel killed the 4th victim, and together they buried the bodies. Jean-Michel, for his part, admitted that he led the victims to the blockhouse. But once inside, he left them with his brother and went back for the keys he had left in the van, waiting about an hour without knowing what his brother was doing to the victims. When he returned, his brother showed him 4 bodies lying on the crest of the dune. The 2 of them buried them. In other words, each brother denied committing the assaults and the killings, claiming that at most he merely helped bury the bodies. Unable to rely on the suspect's statements, the investigating judge and detectives waited for evidence that could prove the brothers' involvement in the murders. Forensic experts began by examining the van. It was an ideal trap. The lock on the rear door had been tampered with so that it could only be opened from the outside. The van had been cleaned out. However, on closer inspection, investigators found a small piece of an earring, a fragment of Audrey's earring that had been torn off. It was proof that the girls had been brutally assaulted inside the van. The problem was that, apart from the jewelry, police found neither the brothers' DNA nor the girls' DNA. They discovered several suspicious stains, possibly blood, but no analysis could be carried out. Of course, the brothers had cleaned the vehicle thoroughly, but in any case, in 1999, the police did not yet have today's advanced DNA testing methods. As a result, there was very little physical evidence tying the Gurdon brothers to the crime. The DNA found on the victims' bodies did not allow investigators to identify the rapist with certainty. Learning this, Jean-Michel seized the opportunity to retract his earlier statements and deny any involvement in the crime. With little evidence and contradictory statements, the investigators' only hope was a reconstruction of the crime scene. Jean-Michel refused to cooperate, so only Jean-Louis' account could be tested. He showed the route that he, his brother, and the victims supposedly took to the blockhouse. Or rather, not walked but picked their way, because they first had to go down to the beach and then move along the boulders. It is important to remember that it was raining the night of the tragedy, and the tide rose almost to the blockhouse. Could 2 brothers really have forced 4 girls to go over wet, slippery rocks in pitch darkness? but Jean-Louis insisted that his brother then took each girl up to the top of the dune. He described the order in which his brother led them away, of course not by name but by their costumes. Yet, inside the blockhouse it was completely dark, and the brothers had no flashlight. How could he have made out their outfits? Moreover, the route he indicated is littered with even greater obstacles. There is barbed wire along the way on which not a single scrap of fabric was found, even though the girls could not have climbed over it without tearing their voluminous masquerade costumes. A thorough examination of the girls' costumes revealed no rips, not even snags. After this reconstruction, there were more questions than answers. The main ones were, under what circumstances were the girls killed, and how did the brothers divide the roles between them? A psychiatrist who spoke with them described them as dangerous predators, especially Jean-Michel. Could either of them have gone unsatisfied? And yet each of them kept insisting that, at most, he only helped the other bury the bodies. Now that the investigation was complete, it would be up to the jury to resolve this dilemma. On October 16, 2002, the trial of the brothers began in Saint-Omer. In court, it emerged that just a few days before the carnival, the predators had already been out hunting for prey. They had nearly abducted a young woman in Berck-sur-Mer. It was 7 p.m. She was in a phone booth, while her boyfriend was calling from another booth nearby. The young woman noticed a van with green stripes that slowed down beside the booth. The driver, whom she identified as Jean-Michel, stared at her as the sliding door opened and Jean-Louis appeared, already preparing to get out and force her inside. Luckily, at that moment, her boyfriend came closer. Jean-Louis saw him, shut the door, and the van pulled away again. This was not the only similar story the jurors heard. It therefore seemed that the brothers had bought the van specifically to kidnap young women. However, Jean-Louis continued to claim he had done nothing. Talking to his brother was like talking to a wall, and the prosecutor feared that the jurors might convict only Jean-Michel, believing in Jean-Louis' passive role. Jean-Louis, perhaps unintentionally, was playing a winning hand. That is why the prosecutor asked for everyone involved in the trial to be taken to the crime scene. This is done very rarely, but in this case the prosecution considered it necessary in order to understand how events unfolded that night. On October 25, 2002, all the parties to the trial went to Sainte-Cécile Beach. As expected, the jurors could not even reach the blockhouse, let alone climb to the top of the dune, crossing several stretches of barbed wire. It would have been impossible to make such a journey at night without the victims tearing their clothes or trying to escape. Clearly, the girls had never been in the blockhouse. This also explains why, despite the many signs of violence, no sand was found in their intimate areas. In other words, according to the autopsy results, the rapes could not have taken place on the beach. The prosecutor was convinced that the assaults and killings happened in the van with both brothers present. The two of them got the girls into the van, promising to drive them to the beach. When Isabelle realized they were not going the right way, she panicked and tried to open the door, but in vain. Jean-Louis beat her violently to calm her down. Jean-Michel, meanwhile, parked the van in a secluded corner of a campsite in the dunes, deserted at that time of year. He turned off the engine and joined the girls and his brother in the back of the van. The van was the murder weapon. It was there, in those horrific conditions, that the girls were beaten and killed. Peggy's DNA, found under Amelie's fingernails, adds further heart-rending detail. While they were being abused, the girls clung to one another, seeking strength and comfort from their sister and their friend. After that, everything becomes simple. You just open the door, walk 20 meters, and you are at the top of the dune. What we do not know, and never will, is what exactly the first brother did, and what exactly the second did. The precise circumstances of the tragedy may remain unclear, but the guilt of both brothers is beyond doubt. Because it is so hard to separate one brother's crimes from the other's, since they prepared together, terrorized the area together, the brothers were dubbed the Siamese Brothers of Horror. On October 27, 2002, the verdict was delivered. The brothers were sentenced to the maximum penalty, life imprisonment, with a minimum security period of 22 years for Michel and 20 years for Louis. The slight difference is explained by a simple fact. Without Louis's confession, the police would still have been searching for the girls. The verdict is life in prison. But life doesn't answer what families live with afterward, because the full truth never arrives. Who did what, in what order, and whether a single decision earlier, faster, taken seriously, could have changed anything. Carnival is supposed to be a night you remember forever. For these families, it became the nighttime stopped, and every year, they return to that beach, not for closure, but because some stories don't end.